Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Artificial DM. I'm going to be bringing you part 2 of this RPG horror story. The time a GM became so enraged at a player walkout that she took legal action against us, by Shoe Owner. Part 1 was read by Z Flacco, so if you haven't seen his video, be sure to click this link here, or down in the description box below. Let's go ahead and get into the RPG horror story. In order to move forward with our story, we must first take a few steps back to examine some of the relationship dynamics that existed between Chihuahua and I, and between she and Camel. At the time that Chihuahua and I began our romantic dalliance, Chihuahua and Camel were essentially not on speaking terms, despite living together in their fascinatingly squalid desert home. She spoke in positively scathing tones about her roommate, about her selfishness, irresponsibility, her cruelty, and spite. All of these tracked for me, given what I knew about her, and it was one of the things which we bonded over, early on, before more meaningful connections formed between us. She often voiced her concern that Camel was likely to simply delete the game entirely, rather than allow it to continue without her, and in light of this, I made a point of not only keeping archives of the game, but contact information for everyone in it. Even after the dissolution of our romantic relationship, we were very much on the same team together, and regarded Camel as our mutual antagonist, and someone whom we were essentially running the game around, with the hopes that she would just step down eventually, and let us do our own thing, without constantly living in the shadow of her malignant, squatting presence. Then suddenly, one day, everything changed. Chihuahua and I had launched a bunch of plot lines together to get the game's meta-plot moving, having worked out all the nuances as a team. Then one morning, I wake up to her informing me that she was changing a bunch of major details after discussing them with Camel, and that's how it's going to be. I was kind of gobsmacked that she wasn't asking, or suggesting, or inviting any sort of discussion. She was dictating to me, and what's more, dictating under the aegis of Camel's authority. I asked what was going on, and was informed that the two of them were friends once more. I pointed out things about Camel, which Chihuahua herself had said to me not a month ago, and she became furious with me for using her own words against her. To this day, I can't help but wonder if Camel had opportunistically reforged that friendship, just for the sake of leveraging that friendship to get between Chihuahua and I. I suppose I'll never know, though it certainly wouldn't surprise me, given the cynicism and dishonesty which I would see from her later. This was the one and only time I ever actually got angry at Chihuahua, not just for the sudden reversal, but the curtly dictatorial tone she took with me about it. There was no effort made to make me feel included, or even hide the way that I was being excluded from this process which I'd begun. It wasn't even about the game. It was the sense of personal betrayal from a woman whom I'd loved, and who was treating me like I didn't matter. Nevertheless, I soldiered on, and did my best to work with it. In the months to come, as I mentioned in part 1, Chihuahua began to drift more and more away from the game, and what little interaction she had with it was almost always antagonistic, and disruptive, and unpleasant in nature, as she became less and less engaged. The last meaningful interaction I can recall was her declaring that all of the threads which she was taking part in were now over, because they're taking too long. Completely glossing over the fact that the only reason this was the case was the fact that she hadn't participated in them for months, whilst everyone was eagerly waiting for her to get back to them. All of this fell upon deaf ears. It was all about what mattered to her, not what mattered to anyone else. Right near the end of my time with the game, there were so many active threads with so many characters that it was becoming challenging to keep track of where everything was, and I'd begun designing interactive HTML pages as references for the players with a visual timeline of events, each of them a clickable link which would lead to the thread in question. I put it out there for discussion with the players that it might be a worthwhile idea to include an in-game calendar so that posts could be referenced as taking place on this or that date for easier organization. Camel and Chihuahua were pretentiously silent on the topic. Every player except one was in favor of this, whom I'll call Wolf. Wolf was friends with Camel and Chihuahua, and had been from the beginning, though Wolf was also close with me and a number of other players. Wolf was savagely against even the discussion of the idea, feeling that Chihuahua and Camel might feel unfairly pressured to include it if it was known that literally every other player in the game favored the concept. It wasn't even that anyone had anything bad to say about the idea, it was just the notion of me adding something to the game which everyone liked, at this point, was a step too far. The next day was the admin post from Camel, saying that I was being removed from the co-GM position and that she would be resuming her role. Her rationale was bizarre, claiming that I'd overstepped my bounds and the remit I'd been given, despite the fact that I had chat logs of her agreeing with everything she was condemning me for, which I could, and did, show to anyone who was curious. It was a truly shameless form of deceit which was incredible to behold. At the time that she posted it, virtually everyone else was in the game's chat room with me, one which Camel had never entered, and Chihuahua had been absent from for months. We were all kind of stunned, and instantly moved our discussion to a private chat room, where Camel and Chihuahua couldn't listen in to our discussion of this move. Before we left, Wolf begged me not to leave the game. I told her I'd have to think about it, though, even as I said it, I knew there was no circumstance under which I would continue to spend any part of my leisure time dealing with Camel and Chihuahua's bullshit. How little I knew. In private discussions with every other player in the game, we all very quickly agreed that we'd just go create another game elsewhere, where we'd import our existing characters, stories, and everything else we were enjoying, and simply carry on without Camel or Chihuahua. We agreed not to talk to Wolf about it until it was done, because we knew she was friends with them, and didn't want to put her in the position of having to decide whether to betray the trust of one group of friends or the other that way, but that we would invite her to join us once the new game was created. When the time came, I set up a new game with a similar premise and setting where we could move our characters over to. With a bit of narrative hand-waving, we decided there had been a distortion in the timeline, and the characters all found themselves in essentially the same situation in a new locale, so that we could just pick up where we left off and not have to worry about Camel's absurd drama any longer. We invited Wolf to join us, but she was so heartbroken at having been excluded from this plan that she initially refused to join us. I understood and apologized, bearing her no ill will. We started playing for about a week, when suddenly our game was deleted from LiveJournal, and I received a notification from the site admins that we were being shut down for a DMCA takedown. Apparently, Camel was so enraged that she undertook the legal steps of having our game removed from the site, on the basis of it being an infringement upon her intellectual property. Now let's be clear here. 95% of the characters in both games were borrowed from other properties, movies, TV shows, comics, and the like. The whole foundation of the game was built upon intellectual property theft. I don't say this with any judgment. I was as guilty of it as anyone else. But for Camel to hypocritically leverage this as a means of punishing us for not wanting to play with her was just a surreal level of cynical hypocrisy. Shameless, once more, in a way that I'd never encountered either before or since. And over what? Our not wanting to play pretendy fun-time games with her anymore. I contacted the site admins, and they basically said that their hands were tied, until and unless I won a court case against Camel to demonstrate that the claim wasn't valid, they were not legally permitted to reactivate our game, which meant that the onus was on me to take weeks off of work, costing me hundreds of dollars, travel down to the southern US, costing me hundreds of dollars, retain a lawyer, costing me hundreds of dollars, etc., etc., etc. And all it cost Camel was the time it took her to fill out some nonsense paperwork. The LiveJournal admin candidly admitted that it was a bad law, but that she was powerless to do otherwise in this situation. I contacted Camel, asking her what she wanted in order to resolve this issue in a manner which was mutually satisfactory. She made it clear that she wasn't interested in my satisfaction, and that as far as she was concerned, the matter was resolved. She'd managed to punish me for daring to leave her game, and take all of these players she had never met and had no connection with me. I asked her why she even cared so much about a game which she hadn't even touched in a better part of a year anyway. Why it would have any impact on her when she was so clearly uninvested in the game, and to this, she simply had no response at all. Silence. At this point, we decided that our only move was to create a second new game, and to set it to private. We could all take part, and while Camel would see that it existed, just by checking what communities our accounts were subscribed to, it would be a blank edifice to her. She couldn't fill out another frivolous DMCA claim against us, since she couldn't see or learn anything about it, and thus, there was nothing she could put down on the paperwork to shut us down. This did unfortunately mean that we were essentially trapped behind these walls, and unable to advertise the game to new players, because if they could see the game, so could Camel, and she would have us shut down again. In fact, we noted that she had set her account to following our game, despite not being a member, and indeed, having been preemptively banned. The moment that it was ever anything other than private, she would know, and she would come for us. It was a one-woman siege with instant death rules, and no means with which we might retaliate. At around this time, Chihuahua contacted me to let me know that Camel was doing this specifically to spite me, personally, for what I'd done to both of them. Chihuahua told me that she felt like I had never really loved her, and that I had only been claiming to in order to take advantage of her. I woefully informed her that while I had perhaps loved too easily and too quickly, that didn't make the emotions any less real at the time. It's just that she had done everything in her power to corrode and destroy that love in the months which followed. She asked me how she had done so. In the spirit of good faith, I responded by saying that if she was genuinely curious, I'd let her know in the hopes that going forward, in future romantic relationships, she might understand a bit more about herself, and thus, perhaps, do less to damage the feelings which others have towards her, and gave her a list. Her response began with, "Oh yeah? Well you?" And I'll never know what the rest of it said, since I hit delete on it then and there, and never spoke to her again. A fittingly brusque capstone to our doomed romance. The new game thrived as best it could in these conditions for quite some time to come. A few months later, Wolf would join us. I would later learn that Camel and Chihuahua would consider this such a deep, personal betrayal that they never spoke to her again when she did. I never said so, but I took some small, dark solace in the idea that while I had never held her friendship with them against her, they hadn't done likewise, which felt like a moral victory to me. Once every couple of months, I would glance over at Camel's game. She had a big recruitment drive immediately after we all left, and then apparently lost interest in the game once more, about 3 months later, leaving it to drift off into oblivion and silence, just a dozen or so weeks after she'd subjected us to all this drama. Even so, we never felt comfortably safe enough to make our game not private, feeling that it was very likely that if we ever did, it would be the last day of our game's existence. Nevertheless, while our game couldn't exist in the light of the sun, I was able to take some satisfaction in the thought that her own game had suffered the same neglect as her bathroom mirror, and died in that same smothering darkness. There is sometimes poetry in life. Talk about a Karen. Camel was so petty that she had to find a way to cancel their game. Sometimes it hurts when your friends decide that they don't want to play anymore. However, it sounded like she wasn't even involved in the game, so why did it matter? Thanks again, Flacco, for reading part 1. Be sure to check out his channel if you haven't, and if you enjoyed the tale, please hit the like button, both here and in part 1. That's going to do it for today, and until next time, hope you feel inspired.